The world outside kept moving, but inside that cold, narrow cell, time stood still. The walls were gray, chipped by years of stories no one remembered, and in the middle of it all sat a man who once commanded empires. His name was Diddy, a name that used to echo in arenas, light up billboards, and move generations. But tonight, it was just a whisper swallowed by the silence of confinement. Every morning in prison starts the same, a metallic clang, footsteps echoing in the corridor, and the distant hum of other inmates trying to survive another day. For Diddy, each sound was a reminder of how far he had fallen. The man who once ruled with rhythm and swagger now lived by the rules of another world. A world where fame meant nothing, and every face was a mirror of loss. He sat on his narrow bed, the thin blanket rough against his skin. The air was heavy with the smell of steel, sweat, and solitude. Somewhere down the hall, someone laughed, not with joy, but the hollow kind that hides pain. Diddy didn't join in. He just stared at the wall, tracing invisible lines, lost in the echo of his own thoughts. He remembered the flashing cameras, the flashing lights, the life that felt unstoppable. Private jets, champagne nights, studio sessions that went till dawn. The music, that was his soul. Every beat carried a piece of his story, every lyric a confession wrapped in rhythm. But those beats were gone now. What played in his head was silence, the kind that hurts, the kind that asks questions you don't want to answer. There were no more entourages, no stylists, no flashing bulbs. Just the hum of the fluorescent light above, and the distant sound of chains. He could almost hear the echoes of his own lyrics from years ago, lines about power, loyalty, and success, but now they sounded like ghosts. The irony stung. He had sung about being untouchable, and now he was more trapped than ever. He thought about his children, their smiles, their voices, the way they used to run into his arms after long days in the studio. That memory hurt more than the cold. He wondered what they thought of him now, if they missed him, if they still looked for him in the crowd, or if they too had turned away like the rest of the world. Regret is a slow poison in a place like this. It creeps in quietly, then takes over your mind. Every night, Diddy would lie awake staring at the ceiling, replaying moments that once felt like victories. The deals, the fame, the parties, all the people who said they'd never leave. He wondered where they were now, who still said his name with respect, who whispered it with pity, who pretended not to know him at all. The guards didn't look at him as a celebrity. To them, he was just another inmate, another story, another man behind bars. They called him Combs, not Diddy, not Puff. That name, the one that carried decades of culture, had been stripped away by the system. Here, he was just a number, a statistic in a cold report. Sometimes, when the cell block went quiet at night, he'd hum a tune to himself. Not the hits the world knew, but soft melodies that came from somewhere deep inside, songs about loss, forgiveness, and time. The walls didn't respond, but somehow, it made him feel human again. He missed the noise, the chaos, the spotlight, but most of all, he missed being believed in. Fame had always been his armor. Now, stripped of it, he faced his real self for the first time in decades. The man in the mirror wasn't the mogul anymore. He was tired, broken, searching for meaning in a place where hope came in whispers. One evening, as the sky outside turned red, he walked to the small window at the end of the hall. The sunset painted the prison yard in gold, a cruel kind of beauty, out of reach. He placed his hand on the bars and closed his eyes. For a moment, he imagined he was back on stage, thousands of fans chanting his name. He could feel the heat of the lights, the pulse of the music, the joy of being alive. Then the echo faded, replaced by the distant clank of a guard's keys. Reality hit like a punch. He turned back to his cell, eyes heavy, steps slow. The silence followed him. In the corner sat an old notebook, its pages worn. Inside, scribbles, thoughts, lyrics, prayers. He picked it up and flipped through, reading fragments of himself. Loyalty fades. Power fades, but truth stays. He had written that months ago, but now it hit harder. Truth, the one thing that never left him, even when everything else did. Diddy wasn't used to asking for forgiveness. But now, in that cell, he found himself whispering quiet prayers, not to undo what was done, but to understand it. Maybe this is what I needed, he thought. Maybe the silence is what saves me. Nights were the hardest. When the world outside slept, his memories woke up. Faces, voices, flashes of a life that felt like another world. Sometimes he'd dream of walking free, of hugging his kids, of making music again. But when he opened his eyes, all he saw were walls. Still, he held on to that dream because in a place like this, dreams are the only freedom left. For the fans who once saw him as untouchable, this version of Diddy was unimaginable. But behind those bars, he wasn't the superstar anymore. He was a man learning how to live without applause, without control, without pretending. The fame had been a mask. Prison stripped it away. What was left was the real story, raw, fragile, human. And as he lay back on his bed, the hum of the lights above him like a low song, a tear rolled down his cheek. Not for what he lost, but for what he finally saw, the truth of a life that had always been too loud to hear itself. For the first time in years, Diddy wasn't running from the silence. He was learning to face it. Morning came like it always did, pale, cold, and silent. The light slipped through the small square window, hitting the cracked floor, but it didn't warm the room. Diddy opened his eyes slowly, his body stiff from another sleepless night. He'd been awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the same sound of keys, footsteps, and whispers. Every morning felt like the same day repeating itself, a loop that never ended. He sat up on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. In the world outside, he once woke up to calls from producers, to the sound of beats blasting through speakers, to the noise of life happening around him. Now he woke up to nothing but silence. And that silence had become his mirror. It showed him everything he didn't want to see. His mind wandered to the people who used to be around him. The ones who laughed the loudest, who smiled the widest, who said, "We got you always." But in this world of steel bars, no one came. The phone didn't ring. Letters didn't arrive. The visits stopped. He used to think fame built loyalty. Now he understood it only borrowed it. Every once in a while, he'd hear his own name on the prison TV, a headline, a debate, a reminder that the world still spoke about him. But it wasn't the way it used to be. There was no celebration, now only judgment, curiosity, and silence. Diddy's empire crumbles, from music to mistakes. The words cut deeper than the cold air in his cell. He turned the TV off and sat in the quiet again. The echo of those words stayed in his mind like ghosts that refused to leave. Empire. He laughed bitterly to himself. What was an empire without peace? What was success if it couldn't follow you into the dark? He picked up the small notebook again, the one with his handwriting. Full of half-written thoughts, he flipped to a blank page and wrote slowly, his hand shaking. The power, the wealth, the image had been made of smoke. Beautiful, but never real. Sometimes, when the prison went quiet, he'd talk to himself. Not loud, but just enough to feel like someone was listening. He'd say things he'd never said to anyone. "I miss the real me," he whispered one night, his voice breaking. The one before the money, before the headlines. His eyes filled with tears, but he didn't wipe them away this time. He let them fall, tracing the lines of his tired face. There was a photo tucked inside his notebook, a picture of him holding his son. The boy was smiling wide, proud, unaware of what the world would become. Diddy looked at that picture every day. It reminded him of what mattered, and also of what he'd lost. He remembered birthdays he missed, calls he didn't answer, promises he made but never kept. For years, he told himself he was working for them, that every deal, every show, every late night was for his family. But now, in this stillness, he saw the truth. He wasn't building for them. He was building for the applause. The sound of the metal door opening broke his thoughts. A guard stepped in to drop his meal, a plastic tray with food he barely touched anymore. "You good?" the guard asked without looking up. Diddy didn't answer. The man nodded and walked away, the door clanging shut behind him. The silence returned, louder than before. He pushed the tray aside and went back to staring at the wall. The wall had become his canvas. Some nights, he'd trace imaginary lines, studio lights, city skylines, faces from the past. He saw them all there. He talked to them sometimes, to friends who were gone, to the version of himself that used to believe he was unstoppable. "I thought I was invincible," he whispered. "But even kings fall." The cell light flickered above him, buzzing like a tired memory. He looked at the small reflection in the metal sink. The face that looked back wasn't the same one fans once cheered for. His eyes had changed, softer, darker, filled with something heavier than pride. It was pain, yes, but also understanding. He'd begun to realize something that fame never taught him. When everything is taken away, you finally see who you are. And in that cell, stripped of every illusion, he was seeing himself clearly for the first time. Days passed, each one slower than the last. Diddy had started writing letters he never sent. Letters to his children, to old friends, to himself. Some were apologies. Others were confessions. He wrote about fear, about loneliness, about the guilt of having everything and still feeling empty. He wrote about the fans who once lifted him higher than he ever imagined. "I wish you knew how much I loved you," he wrote, "and how much I needed your love to feel alive." At night, he'd fold those letters and hide them under his mattress, as if saving them for a day that might never come. Maybe one day the world would read them and understand the man behind the fame, the one who was broken long before the world saw him fall. He started hearing a voice in his head, not madness but memory. His mother's voice, gentle, strong. "Don't let the darkness win," she used to tell him. He closed his eyes and repeated it to himself every night. Don't let the darkness win. But some nights it did. Some nights he broke. He'd sit on the floor, head against the wall, shaking from the weight of it all. He'd think about walking out one day, and how different the world would be. Would anyone be waiting? Would anyone care? The thought scared him. The idea that maybe the world had already moved on. That maybe he had become a memory too. One evening during yard time, he looked up at the sky. The clouds were moving slowly, golden from the setting sun. For a second, it felt like the universe was still talking to him, even here. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. "If I ever get another chance," he said quietly, "I'll make it right." The guard blew the whistle. Yard time was over. The sky darkened again. The bars closed. And so did his heart. Back in his cell, he sat on the bed, notebook open, pen in hand. He wrote the final line of the night. "Maybe prison isn't my punishment. Maybe it's my mirror." He put the pen down and stared at those words until his vision blurred. Then he lay back, staring at the ceiling once more. The hum of the lights sounded almost like music now, faint, distant, fading away into the dark. And as his eyes closed, one last tear slipped down his cheek, quiet, real, and human. Night fell heavy that day, darker than usual. The air inside the prison was still, as if even time was holding its breath. Diddy sat by the window again, but this time he didn't look outside. He just stared at the small patch of light on the floor, watching it fade as the sun disappeared. He didn't count the days anymore. Somewhere along the line, the calendar stopped meaning anything. There was only before and after, before the fame died, and after the silence began. He hadn't spoken to anyone all day. The other inmates had stopped trying. Fame was a strange thing in a place like this. Some looked at him with envy, others with pity, but most just didn't care. The world that once chased his attention now had no time for his pain. The nights were the hardest. That was when his thoughts became the loudest. He'd lie on the bed, eyes open, and see flashes of his old life like broken film reels, red carpets, studio lights, laughter echoing from crowded rooms. He saw the faces of friends, lovers, strangers who once called him family. They all blurred together now, fading like smoke. He remembered the sound of crowds chanting his name. The energy, the power, the illusion of forever. He had lived for that sound. But now, in this cell, the only sound that echoed was his heartbeat, slow, steady, tired. Every day, he felt himself disappearing, not just from the headlines, but from memory itself. The guards walked past him like he was invisible. The world outside spoke of newer stars, newer scandals. Diddy had become a ghost, alive but forgotten. He started writing again that night, in his worn-out notebook. The pen shook slightly in his hand, but he kept going. "I used to think I was made of steel," he wrote. "But I was only made of sound. And when the sound stopped, I did too." He closed the notebook and leaned his head back against the wall. The silence pressed in on him like weight. He thought about all the things he'd said over the years, about power, strength, never backing down. But in truth, all he wanted now was peace. Not fame, not money, just peace. Sometimes he'd look at the small mirror above the sink. The man looking back was a stranger. The eyes were the same, but the fire was gone. What remained was something softer, broken. The truth beneath all the layers of pride and performance. He picked up the photo of his kids again, the same one he'd stared at 1,000 times. Their smiles still gave him warmth, but tonight it hurt even more. He whispered, "I'm sorry." His voice cracked on the words. "I thought I was giving you everything, but I was just giving you less of me." Tears fell silently, one after another. They landed on the photo, leaving tiny marks on the faces that still smiled through his pain. There was no audience here. No applause. Just a man finally learning what love really meant, and how much it had cost him to chase everything else. Outside his cell, the lights dimmed as the prison settled into night. Somewhere, a distant siren wailed. The sound lingered in the air before fading, leaving behind that same deep silence that had become his only companion. He lay down and closed his eyes. His mind drifted to memories, small moments he'd never appreciated before. His mother's hands when she used to pray for him. His first studio mic. His first hit song. His friends laughing in the back of the studio, promising that the dream would never end. He smiled faintly, not out of happiness, but out of sorrow for all that time took away. Was it all worth it? He whispered into the darkness. There was no answer, only the faint hum of electricity in the walls. He imagined his fans, the millions who once screamed his name, who found strength in his music. He wondered what they'd think if they saw him now. Would they still believe in him? Would they still love the man behind the name? Or would they turn away, unable to face the reality that even heroes break? He remembered a concert once, years ago, where the crowd sang his song back to him, word for word. Thousands of voices rising as one. That memory came rushing back now. And for a brief moment, he could almost hear it again. But the sound faded, replaced by the silence of his cell. And that silence felt final. He sat up suddenly, tears streaming down his face. I just wanted to make people feel something, he said softly. That's all I ever wanted. His voice broke into a whisper. But now I can't even feel myself. The weight of it all pressed down, the choices, the pride, the loneliness. He felt like he was drowning in the same success that once made him feel alive. Every mistake, every betrayal, every regret came flooding back like waves crashing in the dark. He didn't cry loud. He just sat there, shaking, the tears falling quietly. There was something sacred in that silence, a confession that didn't need words. He took the notebook again and turned to a blank page. He wrote slowly, carefully, like each word was a piece of his soul being laid to rest. Tell them I'm sorry. Tell them I was human. Tell them the music was real, even if I wasn't. He closed the book and held it to his chest. For a long time, he didn't move. The cell light flickered above him, and the night grew still. Somewhere outside, the wind blew softly against the bars. It almost sounded like a melody, faint, gentle, like one of his old songs carried on the breeze. He smiled weakly, eyes wet, whispering the lyrics under his breath. For a moment, it felt like the music came back to him. Not the fame, not the noise, just the pure soul of it. And then the melody faded. He looked out the small window one last time. The stars were hidden behind clouds. Only darkness remained. He closed his eyes and whispered one final line, not a prayer, not a lyric, but the truth he had run from all his life. In the end, all I ever wanted was peace, and maybe, just maybe, forgiveness. The night swallowed his words. The camera would have faded out there. The same way his light once filled the world and then dimmed away quietly. No headlines, no stage, no applause. Just silence. And somewhere, beyond those cold walls, his fans still played his songs. Not knowing that the man who made them was still listening in the dark, still searching for the peace his fame could never give. Because sometimes, Yanni, the loudest life ends in the quietest room.